Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stephan Livera podcast. Today we're doing something a little bit different. We're doing a bit of a hardware and Bitcoin security panel. We'll chat a little bit about Dark Skippy and other related ideas. So joining me, I think pretty much everyone here is rejoining, is a returning guest. So we've got Salvatoshi from Ledger, we have NVK from CoinKite, we have Craig Raw, known for his work on Sparrow Wallet, we have Rearden Code, aka Brandon Black, working on Swan Vault, but with experience at BitGo and Casa, and we also have AddBTC joining us to share some expertise on hardware. So welcome back to the show, everybody.
Hey,
glad to be here.
Nice to be back.
Great. Well, so look, let's start with obviously Dark Skippy. I think that's something recent. A lot of people are chatting about that. It might be interesting for people, if you want to share some initial reactions, and we can get the conversation started that way.
So, this is not a new thing. Like, nonce attacks are like quite a few years old. The folks from, I think, Blockstream and Bitbox worked on anti-Clapto protocol many years ago now. There is an adequate solution, in my opinion, which is the RFC 6979, which is deterministic nonces plus, deterministic builds and secure boot. Those three things together are sort of like the alternative to anti-Clapto protocols. I'm not sure if you want to get into the weeds of that specific attack for this show, but it's not something new. I think it's an important sort of thing to mention. And, it is something that concerns everybody here who works on this, on Bitcoin security, but it is fairly mitigated. Do we want a good solution, to this attack? Absolutely. I think everybody wants. But nothing is without trade-offs, and the current trade-offs for you to have that is use of USB, which some of us are completely against USB use, prefer air-gap solutions. Some don't. There's varying opinions on this, but essentially, in a nutshell, that's sort of where we're at in the industry with this. I don't think there is anybody here who's freaking out about this attack. Including the people who wrote the paper.
Right. Anyone else want to jump in here?
Yeah, I would love to jump in and just say that it's really, really important when we're talking about any kind of attack or threat, whether it's in general software or in self-custody software, to think about the threat model and the threat actor who's going to actually take action on this attack and how they're going to target people and how they're going to get this attack actually to the end user victim. And I think that's what's kind of lost. This attack looks so bad. If this software gets on a device, it can exfiltrate the nonce in just 2 signatures. Okay, but how did it get there? What was the path? Who was the threat actor who got the software there, who modified the hardware in transit? How did they intercept the hardware without anyone knowing? All of these other things are part of the threat model. And so we have to keep in context the entire threat model, not just, oh, this looks so bad in this very isolated case.
Yeah.
Yep, so I'll jump in as well. So first of all, shout out to Robin and the others for the paper. For the website was really well written and well presented, and is definitely an improvement over the previous ways of doing this kind of attack. I think the biggest difference, apart from being more efficient, is the fact that it no longer requires the device itself to do expensive grinding that would have been harder to hide on embedded devices that are quite weak in terms of computational power, because it moves the grinding more on the receiver of the communication rather than the sender. I think that's the biggest practical difference between how the attack will be done before with nonce grinding compared to how it's done in Dark Skippy. But yeah, I agree with Rearden that you need to put the attack in the category of all the possible things that in that security model you can do. So what are all the possible malicious behaviors a hardware wallet that is compromised could have? And so mitigating one specifically only makes sense if one looks at the whole class of other possible misbehaviors. And is that the most practical way of putting a backdoor in a hardware wallet? I think there are other ways that are almost equally bad. And so it only makes sense to mitigate if you can protect yourself from many or possibly all of them at the same time.
Craig, I'm curious to get your... Go on, NVK.
Go ahead, Craig.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. My thoughts on it are, firstly, I think, it's well worth listening to the podcast you did, Stephan, about 2 episodes ago. I think it was a very reasonable text there in terms of there's no need to panic. There's no need to change anything now. I think it's an interesting new attack, but as we've been saying, there are many different kinds of attacks, and mostly they are not the way you are likely to lose your funds. There are much easier ways to lose your funds. So if we can find a way to make signers less risky to use, to kind of take away these edge cases, which are very unlikely to happen, but nevertheless could happen, without any real cost, then great, we should do it. What we should try and avoid, though, because the other part that's not really talked about is the user experience is not just security, it's not just privacy, but it's also the UX, the kind of what is the experience like. And if you are, for example, having to do multiple rounds of QR scanning for an air-gapped device, that's likely going to be really not a nice, a pleasant user experience. And those are the kind of things where, you don't see people talking about that quite as much. So it sounds very much like the authors of Dark Skippy are aware of that, and they are, working on a solution which doesn't involve that. We'll have to see if there are any other downsides, like bloating the PSPT size or anything. But I'm sort of a believer in making practical products that people want to use, not trying to make the most secure product that no one uses because it's simply too hard to use. So there is a difference between those two, and that's kind of how I see it. And I hope that we have a practical, improvement in future. But I'm not particularly worried about this attack today.
Yeah. Okay, AddBTC, we haven't heard from you, so if you have any comments or responses to the other panelists.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off what Craig said. So for everyone that doesn't know me, I've got a experience in consumer electronics for almost 20 years now. I've shipped millions of products. So my experience is not in the Bitcoin world hardware-wise, but it's outside of that. So consumer electronics, making devices for people that need to be secure, need to be usable. And like Craig is saying, there is a perspective where how far is too far for not even just the average user, but for normal users to get in a place where they just pwn themselves. And that's something I've been really critical and gained some attention on Twitter for my calling out of Seed Signer, and the lack of signed updates ultimately is one of the most problematic parts of that hardware. And this issue, along with many others, can be mitigated by that one factor, a simple signed hardware where you have an internal signing that checks and make sure that the vendor's software, the vendor's signature is checked and approved before pursuing boot on the device. And it's a simple thing. And specifically, one of the reasons that this was used on Seed Signer was that it was not present and easily loaded. Software ran with no knowledge of what the original code was intended to be, and this is a real concern. This is a concern in consumer electronics in general, and most companies that are legitimate, that are producing stuff, especially here in North America and Europe, are coming to the same conclusion that most devices need to have some sort of internal confirmed signature of the vendor. And ultimately, that's what happens is that the trust needs to rely somewhere ultimately to some point where you, the user, and the vendor can have an agreement ahead of time that you can say, okay, I can't trust anything, but I can at least verify that this vendor signature is correct. And there is a level of trust there that it's hard to avoid. I mean, ultimately, I think the best way to avoid this would be you calculating doing all the calculations and the encryption yourself on a pad of paper, maybe with a very simple calculator that doesn't do anything, right? And mathematically that's difficult, and practically it's impossible. So and my perspective is coming from the point of how little hardware do you need and how little user interface do you need that's practical and secure. So
Yeah.
We have a calculator vendor in the chat.
what's that?
There's a calculator vendor in the chat.
That's right.
That's right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
It's funny because, it's known, right, for the decades now that the best like reasonable practical way of handling a lot of this is by software attestation, right? Like so in secure boot. So the device does its best to remain whole, right, so that it can attest that the firmware is coming in is good by the manufacturer, right? Like, is that perfect? Absolutely not. But it does create like a few orders of magnitude more protection, right? Because you're not just getting something that you can't like probe in all parts of the system in order to find out if it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? The guys from Ledger, Salvatoshi is here, like they have a different model, right? Where you trust in the vendor, these guys are huge and, they're going to get sued to death if they do something stupid. And, there is trust, right? At some point in the stack, if you can't verify everything yourself, right? I think we're at a place that's insanely amazing already. With at least the verifiable hardware. I mean, like you can verify every line of code. You can buy the chips yourself from DigiKey, like replace them on the hardware, load the new firmware in, and validate that's doing what it's supposed to do. Like it's pretty crazy, and it was not possible before the Bitcoin space was around. I think this whole conversation got a little bit like muddled because there is like some hardware out there that essentially has no physical security to it, and it was used as the means to display this attack. And it created some confusion in the space as to like what's possible and what's not possible, right? And just sort of like as a quick side note here, it's like, if you don't trust a manufacturer and you cannot check it, I mean, a manufacturer can do 50 other things to take your Bitcoin from you, right? Like, I mean, they can just ship, a rainbow table of private keys, in the device. They don't have to get creative with like nonsense, right? There is many other ways of doing this. So, and some of the hardware that does have anti-collateral protection, like doesn't have other kinds of protections, right? It does different kinds of trade-offs. So this conversation is extremely complicated when you get into the weeds, because it's like what group of trade-offs you're trying to achieve for a maximum sort of security versus practicality, right? And I think like the space itself is very good. We have not seen, at least with the major manufacturers, like we have not seen any sort of like attacks that like take the Bitcoin from people out of these devices. So, again, I feel like some of the reaction is a little bit misplaced. It's like maybe because it's like people that don't work on hardware have sort of like a lot of opinions about it. But I think we're in a pretty good place.
Okay, yeah. And so I guess as I'm understanding it, what we're talking about here is this idea that we shouldn't be sort of absolutist about one particular attack. Just because there's one particular attack that's out, it doesn't mean that everything has to be put against mitigating that one way of getting pwned, right? There are multiple ways to get pwned, as you said. And as you mentioned, as ADD has spoken about, as NVK has spoken about with secure boot, it's this idea that the hardware is shipped with a way of checking the firmware updates that are being sent to make sure that it's correctly signed by the manufacturer. And so the point of that means it's a lot harder to be pwned in terms of using incorrect hardware, though obviously not impossible. You could have been sent a wrong device from the start, and I guess at that point, you were just pwned from the beginning. So I guess that's one way to put it. Maybe it's important let's put it in context then. So, speaking today, August 2024, what are some of the ways that users lose coins? I guess historically it was user error, it was people losing their backups, or maybe device failure. Like, what would you say, if you guys had to just kind of comment, what were some of the ways people lost most of their coins? And, do you see that as, how has that changed over time, right? Maybe in the early days, certain attacks or certain ways of losing your coins, and now it's going to be this, and in the future it'll be something else.
I think bad backups were historically like the most common way to lose coins. People just didn't have their seed backed up at all. Or before seed, it was just a bunch of private keys and people lost coins that way. I think I lost some that way. And then subsequently, I think it's really been mostly the social attacks. That's part of why hardware devices are so important, because they help protect you against certain categories of phishing attacks. So I think it's really the scammer that called Junsith, like that subcategory of attacks is now the most common way. And then along with the ones that Lop reports, the physical attacks.
If I have to attribute, don't have hard data for this, it's impossible because most people don't even talk about it. We hear privately as vendors a lot of horror stories. So I'd say number one is exchanges. I mean, through time, I remember the very early days. I mean, was it mywallet.com or MyBTC? I can't remember now. There's been through time. It's like leaving your money in the exchanges is probably like the number one way of losing your money. And that sort of spills over to the social attacks, because then people convince you to give your password to the exchange or reset your password, and then they get in. Another one that was quite successful actually is people get DM'd and say, hey, I am from this major manufacturer. Can you please give me your seeds so I can help you remove the viruses from your hardware wallet, right? Like, people fall for that because they don't understand what a seed is. People with paper backups, especially pre-BIP 39, right? Like people used to have, and BIP 32, people would have one private key per UTXO. So, people would lose. I mean, like, God knows how much Bitcoin I have lost in paper backups that, went to the washing machine. Computer, like people have like private keys on their computers, especially Windows, and even Bitcoin Core way back in the day had a major hole because people didn't set up a password on their RPC, so their coins got taken. Computers are one major hole, right? Especially Windows, people get their coins taken away from them that way if they are sitting on the computer. Their phones, people get mugged. It's tricky, but from people having hardware wallets and using hardware wallets, it's very rare that you hear a story of somebody that maybe was not forced with a gun to their head to give up their coins.
Yeah, there's I completely agree with what's been said. Down on the kind of, this happens like 1,000th of the time of any other kind of attack. Bad entropy is the kind of scary attack that you do see it from time to time. Someone will use a device which had bad entropy. We had the case of that library recently, which was creating seeds with bad entropy. And in fact, the cold card as well allowed you to create a wallet without a minimum number of dice rolls, which has now been changed, but a few people, I wouldn't say many, but a few people kind of went out there and rolled their dice 10 times, and that's just not enough. So they lost their funds.
It's a great boat accident story.
Yeah. So, bad entropy is, and I think this was actually also mentioned by the Dark Skippy guys, because that's ultimately the source of most of these kind of attacks that happen on the signer. So that's definitely one. If you want to be super secure, definitely want to add your own entropy to the entropy that the device provides. So that's one that I would add in that I've seen from time to time.
Just to be clear, though, the bad entropy attacks on hardware wallets have been when someone tried to do their own entropy and failed, not on bad entropy actually from the device. So, I agree that adding your own entropy is good, but be very mindful of how you're doing it.
It's hard to take some of the stories at face value, and somebody rolls 10 dice rolls, or rolls or gets lazy and types 0 99 times. If a hardware wallet was able to know the exact entropy amount that you entered, you would be as capable as breaking that entropy, right? So, we try to do our best, try to protect against some stuff, but, there really is a limit, right? Because that's the inverse problem.
Yeah, I actually have an open issue on Sparrow where people want me to implement user-created entropy. And I think the downsides are greater than the upsides. I think people are more likely to lose funds from doing that than improve things. So I currently have no intention to implement that. But it's just an example. The reality is humans are extremely bad at being random.
I think what's cool about the dice, and it's good that you brought that up, is that, it's a way to prove that the vendor is honest. It's not a good way for you to do it at your entropy. It's just one more item. But one thing I do love is like the mix of user-generated entropy plus the device doing hard math, right? And breaking that up into good entropy with its own random number generator, right? So combined entropy is a fantastic way for you to have like some certainty that the device, we don't even have to talk about being malicious, right? They're just bugs. Bugs happen, right? So, with this added entropy of the user on top of like some very high quality TRNG and also some sorings of other parts of the device, you have like some reasonable guarantees, right? That things are not being messed with even by bugs. I really like that sort of like middle ground for this kind of stuff.
And we should kind of look at other industries. That's how all of the kind of Linux and Unix kernel managers for entropy have gone over the years. They have gradually found more and more little sources of entropy, and they XOR them all in. So the end result is good entropy, even though most of those sources might be crap because they've mixed everything together. And so we should take the knowledge from the other industries and use it for ourselves.
I mean, one of the running theories for Luke's loss of 200 BTC based on his PGP keys, that like he used that specific systems. There was a vintage of some Linux that he used that had a massive hole, or it was the hardware, I can't remember now, or it was the hardware on the computer that had a massive hole on its entropy creation, right? And then boom, and he gone. There is professionals on the market now offering devices that are like really good, and the people who can read the code like agree that they think it's really good, and there's like a lot of them that are actually really good, and people can choose which one most fit their sort of preferences, their culture, their whatever, right? So, if you're using a commercial device in the market now, you're doing very well, right? And if you don't like them, just use 3 of different ones in multisig, and all this conversation is completely out the window, right?
Yeah. One other question around entropy while we're here. This is something I recall from my earlier podcast, the Dark Skippy one, talking with Lloyd and Nick and with Robin. One point I think Lloyd was making was kind of distinguishing between entropy at the point of key generation, right? So people might do, dice rolls or something like that and generate, and that's part of how they're generating their 24 words, which then, that's the master private key, then the master XPub, and having addresses off of that. But he also spoke about this idea of making sure we've got enough entropy at the time of signing. When you're signing a transaction, right? When you're going to send some Bitcoin. I'm curious if anyone on the panel here has thoughts on that. Is there something more that has to be done there, or is there something different that could be done at the time of signing for entropy?
I mean, for single sig... Oh, go ahead, Craig.
Yeah, you actually don't use entropy if you're using the RFC 6979. Because we're all creating, everyone using that approach is doing it in a very specific way that Bitcoin Core does it. So we all create byte for byte the exact same binary signatures, and we can compare those byte for byte. Now, if we were introducing our own randomness into the process, then obviously that wouldn't be byte for byte the same. So it's only in the case that you're not following that exact process that you would be trying to introduce your own entropy.
So, and I think this is an important point to bring up because, when you ask a cryptographer what's the solution for something, it's more cryptography, right? So the boys from FrostSnap are like, they're hard, like thinking about like doing Schnorr, right? And doing Frost. So, and for Frost, like you need the nonces to be extremely
It's a problem
safe.
They already have to deal with, yeah.
It's a problem that they have to... And there is no good solution yet on how to do that, right? So they're still working on how to do Frost because you have to essentially pre-share nonces, right, to use. So I think their headspace is like on that, and that's probably why they arrived at this. So they were trying to massive nonces to properly defend them later for Frost, and I think it's going to be like somebody's going to come up with something cool for that. But you know, when it comes to this, I think it's probably the reason why Core does not have an alternative to 6979, right? Like the Core uses this deterministic nonsense as well, and like there has not, like, I mean, like anti-klepto is not even a BIP. Like, you know, like there is no accepted sort of market solution for this. There's only 2 vendors that are of smaller install bases that use this solution, right? Like the majority of the market is not there. Mostly, I believe, because of, you know, the trade-off of the USB and also the UX issue with this protocol, which is very good, but, you know, it requires multiple rounds, right? So I think we're just not quite there. On the good side, though, is this whole drama sort of sparked a lot of good conversation, and there is work being done now. So Moonsettler just proposed something. We have some code being written internally now that we hopefully will talk to him soon. It actually happened this morning. You know, maybe we come up with a solution that is acceptable, but I have a feeling that because this touches cryptography, there's going to be a lot of opinions and sort of bike sheds, and so there may be a few different standards on how to deal with this. But I think solving this problem is a good thing because it de-risks the vendor even one more step. But you know, again, I don't think it's a concern.
Yeah, and I want to throw in there, we use RFC 6979 for ECDSA, but there's no equivalent standard actually for Schnorr signatures. So if you're using Taproot single sig, the core, or the BIP recommended way to do it is with auxiliary randomness. But it has this very like nuanced take where it's like, if you have a good source of randomness, use it here. But of course, not every hardware device does at all times. So there's these nuances in all of these things. And then as folks were saying, with these multi-party signing protocols, whether it's Frost or MuSig2, this is even more nuanced. That's why when I was working at BitGo, I worked with Jonas on the MuSig2 BIP, having the ability for one signer in MuSig2 to be deterministic and still use deterministic nonces, because it's hard to guarantee ongoing good entropy, especially on embedded devices. So perhaps it's better to have some way to do deterministic signing for one of the signers that might be a hardware device in a MuSig or Frost quorum. So there's a ton of nuances in all of this stuff. And we do need to be careful of saying, always use deterministic nonces. Well, you can't do that for a protocol. Always use random nonces. Well, there's not always good randomness. There isn't an always, and device manufacturers and researchers kind of do a lot of work to make the right trade-offs for their devices.
This show brought to you by mempool.space, the world's leading Bitcoin visualizer. And now they've got an accelerator program. So if you have a transaction that you sent at a fee that was too low to get confirmed, now you can fix this with the mempool accelerator. The way it works, you can go and search your transaction, scroll down, click accelerator, and you don't need an account. You can pay with Lightning, and then it'll show you it's now in the process of being accelerated, and then after a few minutes, it's confirmed. And so this is a great way to help you out if you are stuck. And this can happen where maybe your wallet doesn't have RBF or CPFP, or it might help you in situations where it's impractical to go and re-sign. So for example, multi-sig with keys in different locations. And thirdly, even in some Lightning scenarios, perhaps a forced close, you might not be able to use RBF. And so in this case, the mempool accelerator can help you out. So keep it in mind, and you can find out more over at mempool.space/accelerator. And now, back to the show. Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Coldcard Mark IV and the new Coldcard Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, You have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases. You can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. And now, back to the show. Yeah, so it sounds like really it's very case by case, and so perhaps some of the nuance gets lost in kind of online shorter form discussion, because then people are sort of saying, oh, see, if you're not doing this, that, and that, like that's not good. And then it's sort of like maybe it makes sense in this context, but not in that context. Okay. The other element of this is that currently only, two devices have anti-exfil, and obviously the big part of that is it's USB. Those devices are USB. I mean, to be fair, Blockstream Jade has QR, but doesn't have anti-exfil if you use that, obviously. I'm curious. I know NVK, you're obviously quite strongly against USB. How much can you, I guess, put it into context for us? What are the main risks of USB connection, and put that into context for us? And then if anyone else has a different view, let's hear that.
I think AddBTC is going to have an interesting take on this as well, as he so wisely tweeted is the universal serial bus. It is an absolute clusterfuck. I highly recommend people go read the USB SPAC. Is a ginormous problematic thing. It's unsafe, in my opinion, with most of the sort of ARM platforms or any sort of device that has a more general purpose chipset. For computers, I'm not even. It's insane, right? It's horrible. Trezor had a USB attack way back in the day by power differential analysis, right? So they were leaking private key through the USB power bus. Salvatore, you might be able to correct me. There was some USB sort of attack on original ledgers way back then. That it was sort of researcher was not seen in the wild. Trying to secure USB is very difficult. Another aspect that people that don't do hardware often sort of miss is that the same way you program a lot of these hardware wallets at the factory is through the USB serial. So a lot of them use UART. So for example, say Bitbox, right? The same ports you're using to program the device and change firmware on the device, you're using later on by making it more hardened. Cold card allows USB, is extremely strong protection on the USB. But the understanding I have on USB precludes me from suggesting people should use USB unless it's for small amounts of money or for multisig. Then you have specialized hardware, right? So, for example, the folks from Ledger, what they do is they have a smart card chip in there that is designed to be extremely restrictive, right? So they can achieve a much higher level of security on the USB, and I think one of the reasons why they feel comfortable using it. But then you have other trade-offs, right? Now you're stuck with a Java platform, it's closed source, in terms of not being able to review the code. None of these things are without trade-offs, and in my opinion, personally, I don't trust USB, and especially on things like a Raspberry Pi or even more complex devices like that. I don't think it can be secured to an adequate level, especially not because people are malicious, just because bugs happen, right? And if you can close something down, it means it was open to begin with, and it's not a good methodology for when you're trying to secure Bitcoin in the way that is the way that works. So that's sort of my view on this.
I want to throw one really quick thing in that I really want to hear from AddBTC as well. But if you are assuming malicious hardware, which is kind of the context we're in talking about Dark Skippy, if you assume malicious hardware and you're going to plug that into a computer, the malicious hardware has already won. As soon as you plug a malicious USB device into your computer, it has won the war.
You don't have to plug in. Some of them would just beam out, like you do.
Right.
Like there's many attacks that you can, say the HDMI port, or you can actually do LoRa from a Raspberry Pi without an antenna. So the point is, like, a malicious device just gives you bad entropy. Like, I mean, there really is nothing better than that.
Assuming, let's say, you make your own seed using Entropy from SeedSigner or my dice rolling thing that I've published. Like, there's ways you can get a good seed into a malicious device. But then as soon as you connect that to USB, that device guaranteed can exfiltrate that seed, whether you sign a transaction or not. The malicious hardware can exfiltrate the seed if you plug it in, period.
Yeah, and I think my concerns with USB are you're plugging this thing that's so simple into something that has unlimited resources, relatively, right? So you have this computer that has RAM and internet connection. Who knows what you're plugging it into? The abilities of what it can do to USB is enormous. Now, yeah, like if you have a very simple device that it's plugging into, not a full blown USB 5 physical interface, there's more limitations on what can happen there. But somebody had recently mentioned, just put this FTDI UART to USB converter between your processor and the USB. And if for those of you that don't know, this FTDI device is used everywhere, and it's probably one of the most counterfeited parts ever to be counterfeited, because it's such a simple function. It takes USB, it creates this USB interface, and it converts UART to make a virtual COM port for your laptop or your desktop, whatever you're trying to connect it to. So in Asia, they produced these things and duplicated these things, and they're everywhere. And about 10 years ago, everyone knew that they had a bad device because there was some Windows driver that FTDI pushed. I don't know if you guys remember this, and everyone's parts started to stop working, and they're like, "Well, what is this? What's going on?" And the FTDI company decided to push this driver that locked out all these counterfeit FTDI devices, which just upset everyone. But the FTDI device itself now becomes your target. And this thing isn't made for security. Obviously, it could be counterfeited, but all it takes is a vendor ID change, a configuration change of the part, if it's done externally or at the factory or wherever. And now you have a virtual keyboard, a mouse, a modem. I mean, everything that USB can be, that device can be. So sure, you're abstracting your secure microprocessor that a hardware vendor has specifically created to be secure, and then you put this third-party insecure thing in between it. It looks like it simplifies things, it looks like it solves things, but it just moves the goalpost to another spot. So the amount of failure that can occur with some of these things is mind-boggling, and we do the best we can. Things are difficult on the hardware side, but once you connect it to that device with unlimited resources, then you have to be extra diligent from a hardware perspective.
Yeah. Salvatore, anything to add from your side?
I don't fully share the concerns about the USB. Like, I do agree that there are some concerns. Like, for example, differential power analysis is something that did happen in the past, and it was a cause of some vulnerability in different devices. But the point of view is that, well, from the point of view of the vendor, of who's making the hardware, there is an easy solution to the complexity of USB, which is you connect the USB to some simpler thing. For example, a simple MCU that is not, so you don't connect directly the USB to the secure element, which contains the keys. And so this MCU basically can be considered part of the untrusted world, meaning from the point of view of the other components of the hardware, even if the software somehow exploits USB to try to take control of this MCU, they still don't have control of the device because, for example, the screen is not controlled by this MCU, but is controlled by the secure element, for example. So this is the concerns with MCU, I think, can be addressed from the point of view of the constructor. And my point of view is that it's quite limiting to try to do everything air-gapped because it prevents you from doing a lot of interesting, useful things that can actually improve the user security. And so, for example, one of the things that it becomes very hard to do is what if you want to do a multi-sig between your hardware wallet and your software wallet or some other online machine, right? So this in air-gapped mode, it's a lot harder to do, and it has some interesting use case, especially if you want to do something like music, which is a two-round protocol where you have to call both the signers multiple times. And the reason I'm a lot interested in this kind of applications is that in a context where we are able to program our software wallets a lot more thanks to something like Miniscript, this has a lot of interesting use cases, including also fixing in a much more general way the kind of problems that NTX will try to do with for Dark Skippy. I did a talk in Advancing Bitcoin. I also wrote a blog post that I'll give you the link, which tries to analyze this kind of attacks in a much more general way. And the point of view is exactly this, that like you cannot do this kind of exfiltration attack if you have a multi-sig 2 of 2, because now you need to do that on each single device, right? But without Miniscript, if you just do a multi-sig between your hardware wallet and your software wallet, well, that kind of breaks your security model, because now, for example, the software wallet could destroy the private key, the hotkey, and locks your funds out, for example. This is something the hardware wallets don't want the software wallet to be able to do. But in a world where you have Miniscript, you can use this hotkey as an additional key. So it's strictly incremental security in terms of spending. But then, thanks to Miniscript, you can have additional spending policies that become available later for recovery where you don't have the hotkey. And so the point of this blog post was exactly that by constructing carefully these kind of policies, you can actually create software wallets that give a user interface which can even be very similar to the one of a single signature wallet, but it protects from a much bigger class of attacks.
You know, I read your blog post. It was actually really good. So the main issue is that like the current state of the market, right? It's more like just from practical perspective, Miniscript is fairly new, right? I mean, we were trying to put the descriptors for how long? There's wallets in the market that still don't even support PSBT, right? Like, if we talk from just like sort of a current state of the market thing is, the major, like some of the major devices on the market, like they don't have a separation between their MCUs and USB, right? They talk directly. They use the UART on the MCU. And then you have devices like, say, for example, Jade, where, this is the ESP32. It's a fantastic sort of Chinese device from Express If. Lots of memory, lots of cool stuff, not designed for security, right? And the USB is like, straight in there, right? So, what they did is they added the pin server, which is brilliant. Like, but now your hardware wallet needs to talk to a server in order to sign something, which, again, it all depends on sort of like your preferences. And, the majority of the market, it's still on single sig plus passphrase, right? And we should recommend that most people use passphrase if they're on single sig. But, not everybody's going to get there yet. So I do agree with you that, once we see the majority of the people moving on to Miniscript King, multi-sig, or, forms in which a single device is de-risked, then absolutely, right? Like, I do see then not being as much of a risk of having a device connected. But, if you're using single sig, I don't see a safe way for most of the platforms in the market to be connected to USB. Like, it's just a trade-off that, doesn't, like, it's impossible for me to get over. I do sort of like respect the ledger security that he has because of the choice of platform on how it does USB. But that's one device of the market, right? Like every other device in the market is doing, essentially like MCU based USB. And that's why I guess, like, I'm so intense, let's put it this way, mildly, on Twitter about people not connecting things to USB. It really is brutal. A lot of these devices are simply not secure enough for that. And bugs happen, right? And if bugs happen, money gone. That's sort of like my mental model for this stuff.
I do want to be fair to the Jade device. Don't they? I would think they use an external USB serial chip.
It's ESP32. It's the package.
I'm going to double check that because I could swear they use an external USB interface.
I believe the ESP32 might have in the package a UART sort of like a bridge, but it's all part of the same package, right? Like there is no. You can, for example, flash like you can run arbitrary code on a ESP32, the K10 I think they're using. Go ahead.
Without getting too much into the details of the Jade, because we could spend a whole lot of time talking about that, one of the biggest differences that I see between USB-only hardware wallets and those that follow more of an air-gapped route is that the USB ones generally have a proprietary protocol to talk to the hardware wallet. And by that I mean not that it's a protocol which can't be kind of known, but it's more one which is unique to whatever vendor is putting that hardware wallet forward. And that means that you are far more dependent on that vendor going forward. From the point of view, if you have a air-gapped device that is using, for example, UR or barbecue QR codes, or just straight PHBTs, which are shuttled back and forth with an SD card, you really have a standardization there, which is far more than you have with a USB hardware wallet, which, as I say, is using a proprietary protocol. Now, there are luckily open source, or at least open in the sense of third-party interfaces that you can use, and we're lucky to have Ava Chow's HWI, which does a lot of that work for us. But for me, it's certainly feels less secure from a kind of, is this thing going to work in 10 to 20 years than if I have a standardized protocol that is being written up and kind of has been implemented in many different devices or different software packages. Then I kind of know, well, if Sparrow isn't around, we've got other ones. We can rely on that. Whereas right now with the USB hardware wallets, you either use the vendor created software package, or you use HWI, or you might have an integration which is unique to a wallet, for example, like Electrum has. That's kind of, but it's from my point of view, that's a more risky approach. Because you just have fewer kind of people working on that bridge, because that bridge is a proprietary bridge. It's not an open standards compliant bridge.
This show also brought to you by Nomad Capitalist. Nomad Capitalist is a leading provider in terms of offshore tax and lifestyle strategy planning and implementation. They can help you go overseas and legally lower your taxes. As many of you know, I grew up in Australia, but I left. I was sick of it in terms of the taxes and the COVID tyranny and all these other things. And so that's why I left, and now I live in Dubai. But that's not necessarily the place for you. You have to think exactly what works for you, for your family, for your business. And Nomad Capitalists have worked across dozens of different countries. They've helped people get passports, residences, bank accounts, and all kinds of other things. And importantly, it's not just about choosing one place. It may be multiple places. And it may be also about making the pieces fit together in terms of how your business fits with your family and you as an individual. Nomad Capitalists have helped many people in terms of going overseas. And if you're interested, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. This is applicable for people with a net worth above $1 million. That's nomadcapitalist.com/apply. And now back to the show. I see. So it's a point around, let's say, redundancy and being able to recover in the future, let's say 5 or 10 years down the line. Maybe certain things don't have support anymore, or maybe, in that example where it's like a specific vendor software, maybe what if that manufacturer is not here anymore, right? Like, so these are some of the reasons why this kind of redundancy concern is a legitimate one, and kind of having these open standards and open ways of doing things perhaps is preferable. But it's also understandable that different vendors and manufacturers may want to differentiate themselves. They may want to offer more features. So there's always going to be maybe a bit of a tug of war there until something becomes standardized enough that everybody uses the same thing, right?
I mean, remember pre-PSBT world?
Right.
I remember in those days, like we had a multi-sig before Big O was kind of the same thing. And, like we integrated Ledger and Trezor, and this is like over 10 years ago, right? We wanted to have like hardware that was compatible and we wanted to make hardware wallets, but like we were like, we're not going to make a custom USB SPAC for hardware wallet until we found BIP 124 from HL abandoned there. And we built because of that, like because that BIP essentially created a standard for how wallets and hardware wallets sort of exchange information for signing, right? In my opinion, that's sort of like indispensable for how a hardware wallet should. Like every single part of the stack in Bitcoin should be completely vendor independent. That's sort of like my personal opinion on this. Like we have an open protocol, right? There is no reason to do a thing that is not sort of capable by every other device, and so you can just Craig with Sparrow should not even care or know which hardware wallet you're using, ideally, right? That is the goal, in my opinion. Because maybe I created a seed on one wallet and then I don't like it anymore, or I move it to another one. Like nobody should care which hardware wallet you're using, and nobody should care which client wallet you're using either, right? This thing should be completely independent, because if you don't know which hardware wallet you're using, the attacker has a lot less information to attack you. I think that's like a huge information asymmetry advantage for the signers.
Yeah, so something that isn't talked about too often is synchronous communication between an external device. So this is something that, if you think back of how the device can be updated with that malicious software, okay, usually it'll come over the way that the vendor tells the user to update the device. If you're using an SD card, maybe it'll come over SD. If it's using USB, it's probably going to come over maybe USB. The advantage of something like an SD card is that all computers can read an SD card, and all of it's there for you to see. In a trusted SD card is what we're assuming here. And it's more likely to have a trusted SD card than some of these other specific hardware wallet things, in my opinion. But it's slow to move software from an SD card to a device. The advantage you have is it's inspectable. The user can inspect it maybe one day, the next day they could load it on their device. They have time between whenever the information is written to the card and whenever the unit is updated. During that time, you can check Twitter, you can check the vendor's website, you can check email, you can talk to people. There's time that's built in there. The problem with USB is it's instant and it's invisible. The user cannot inspect what's happening, what's being communicated. So there's a level of trust there that makes me uncomfortable. And there's ways you can do that with trusted client-host communications and custom things like Craig was saying. But it still shows vulnerability there. And I think that comes back to this fallacy of having such a thing as an air-gapped device. There is communication that's necessary. And if the communication gets too complicated, it's going to be harder for the user to use that, and they'll start making compromises themselves that you don't expect as the vendor.
Yeah.
A good way to think about synchronies in an attack is, if you're a programmer, imagine like trying to enter something without logs, right? Like try to fix a program without checking the logs, right? That's a level of synchrony you have when you're trying to do something. Now try to sort of break into something without having an immediate response, showing like what's happening, in feedback. And, this sort of like goes to sort of, it's a good way to sort of understand the synchrony that we talk about when we talk about like USB attacks and no USB attacks, aside from, all the other aspects of it. Having direct access to something is very difficult and very different than having indirect access to something.
Okay.
It changes the level of sophistication right, that you need in order to get in there. I mean, sure, Stuxnet is a possibility, right? But there is a reason why those nuclear plants, are not connected to the internet or not connected to other things. It's because
we wouldn't have heard the story if it was. Yeah.
One of the first things you do when you have something important is not connect to anything. It does remove some UX things, but at the end of the day, it's a very reasonable approach to security, right? Because again, we just don't trust the stack. We don't trust the USB spec.
Gotcha. One point I want to pick up on, and sort of related, I think ADD or AddBTC, you were mentioning this idea of inspectability. And I think one question that comes up in my mind is, to what extent is the community relying on social security, right? So because, you could be a total noob who's left your coins on the exchange, so maybe you've got a single signature hardware wallet, you have no idea what a passphrase is or multi-sig, and then, as you kind of advance up, and now at the sort of extreme end, there's really paranoid users who are checking everything. Maybe they're reading code and they're verifying things. Hypothetically, there's someone out there who's building hardware wallets from scratch if they can. Are there any comments there on how much trust is kind of the ecosystem placing on, let's say, those ultra nerd users to go and actually do the inspecting, as that example, right? If in the SD card example or anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's the trade-off. It's kind of the trade-off of automatic updates, right, versus manual updates. Do you automatically update the user to protect them, also introducing this path of risk, right? So that if your automatic update processes are commandeered by some malicious actor, that they can get in there and do all sorts of bad things. Or do you let the user do that themselves? And I think there's arguments for both sides. I would hope that people are listening and looking at other trusted people to kind of help them in some of those communications of problems, but I don't think that's something that would ever be adequate or sufficient. Again, if you make it easy for the user to do that, the user will do it more often. And maybe in those times when they're moving large quantities of Bitcoin, or maybe in the times that are the most essential, are the times when they do that. And then there's other more either easier UX or less trusted ways that they can do that, like a phone wallet, for example, where you just assume everything's working and you just go for it. So yeah, I don't think I really have too many opinions on that. I think having the option to do it, and again, going back to, what I want to see is this ultra paranoid hardware maker myself. I want to have these options. I want to be able to do that when the time arises or if I need to. And the more options I have, the safer I feel. And I can confirm that myself, trust if as few people as possible, and to validate those things. But I think, again, this is probably why that multiple devices exist. We have lots of hardware vendors. We have different users, different needs. And I think that's a good thing to have those options in the community.
Yeah, I think, the whole of Bitcoin is not some abstract technical protocol which just kind of exists apart from, humankind. It is a social process as well. We could look at all kinds of areas of Bitcoin and say, yes, we require humans here, otherwise this thing just won't work. What if we didn't have people who wanted to mine? What if, there's all kinds of different levels to which this is a social process that we're in. And absolutely part of that social process is people checking things and making sure that security as designed is actually implemented and in place. Sure, NVK could decide to implement Dark Skippy. Would someone find it likely? Would that be the end of his business model? Absolutely. Does that make the game theory of doing it very disincentivized? I think so, yes. So, I think that these things absolutely need to exist, do exist, and are part of Bitcoin as we know it.
And when you put this in perspective, right, the device is, verifiable, right? So all the source code is there, right? the chips on it, so the MCU, the secure elements, everything that is there could be purchased from, say, DigiKey, right? The device is clear case. the device comes in a secure bag. When you think about like the amount of steps and people involved in order to either do like a general attack in the whole sort of user base would be nearly impossible, right? Because we're shipping like hundreds of thousands of devices, and the device is like one appears there, like one, because people do check. Contrary to what like Twitter thinks, it's like we do get emails when there is updates like, why did you change this? But a general attack would be like nearly impossible, right? So you'd be targeted attack. Now, okay, great. Like we don't know who you are, right, to receive, and now I have to like convince like a bunch of people within my organization, right, and in the supply chain in order to like send a device that has like evil code that like I don't even know where I'm gonna stick it because there's not enough memory. But assuming there was more memory, right? Like it becomes so insane that like it's just unrealistic, right? Like and yes, we do need solutions to make sure that there is a cryptographic proof to it, yes, but like the practicality of some of these attacks are so absurd that like, okay, we have time to come up with a great solution. We don't have to freak everybody out who are safely right now, right, to go and touch their devices. They're secured somewhere and maybe get robbed or accidentally do something because they're now in haste because some guy on Twitter said that like this is the worst thing that could possibly happen, right? Like the perspective in these things is very important.
I think you got really close to something that I've been wanting to mention in this talk, which is the idea of trust on first use or tofu security, and any device out there with a secure element and a signed upgrade process, whether that's Ledger or Coldcard or Bitbox or many of the others as well, gets pretty darn good trust on first use security. If you get a good device from the manufacturer and you don't let it be in malicious hands, it is very, very difficult for anybody to have even the chance of getting malicious software onto that device. And that's, I think, the strongest thing we have going for us, frankly, in this Bitcoin security. And it goes exactly to your point, NVK, of we don't want people running out and upgrading devices because now they're having to retake a trust leap. They've already got a device that has good trust on first use security in their hands. Don't go buy a new one and switch over because now you've introduced a new trust step that you didn't have before. So it's very nice with devices that have signed firmware updates that you get you take a trust leap when you buy it. And then if you've gotten a good device, which you very likely have, that trust now holds you forward as long as you keep using that device.
Just for perspective, right? Like, it has not been demonstrated to us, even with our first device that only had one secure element and way back then, that an attacker is capable of running arbitrary code without the user knowing. Okay, like that has not been possible, right? Because we have the green light that checks for the user, right? And even if the user blasts some custom firmware he wants to run, it still at boot shows you a message saying, hey, this firmware is not signed by factory, right? So, when the good folks from Donjon managed to see the extract from Mark III, they still not able to run arbitrary code in there, right? Like, and like removing the seed in the way that it was one thing, right? And costed a lot of money to do it. And the risk of destroying the sample, and all the caveats on that attack, which was very cool, by the way. But they're still not capable of changing the secure element in a way that would allow them to stick their own keys in there and then change everything else so they could run arbitrary code. That is not true, right, for a Raspberry Pi or a ESP32, for example, right? Like those devices can run arbitrary code because they cannot secure their boot, right? Like, so there is a lot of nuance in this, and it's nearly impossible for a civilian, right, to understand the complexity of hardware. I mean, like, heck, like, by some of the comments of even some Bitcoin core developers on this attack, I mean, they missed the point of how the hardware actually works. So I think the biggest take from this whole thing is like, please don't freak out and go touch your Bitcoin, because you're going to probably lose your Bitcoin because you freaked out. Don't freak out is always rule number one, right? And then let the dust settle, and then you can sort of figure out like, okay, do I need to learn how to code to review code, or do I trust a little bit, or like where do I go from there? Let the experts sort of battle out on public, and that's the beauty of having so many devices, right? Like everybody goes at each other's throats as soon as there is something new to for a lot of bored technical people to argue about.
Great. Well, I think we've probably should start to wrap up. So let's just take it from here with final comments. If you have any thoughts on how to contextualize this, and maybe what are some of the things that you'd like to see in Bitcoin security in the short and medium term? Any comments?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I just want to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier. When we design products, and I see my skill primarily as a product designer. That's what I do. You have to look at the entire user experience when you try to design a product, and that's not just the security of the product, but how, what is the privacy perhaps that it offers, how easy is it to use. You have to kind of look at the entire package. And I think it's important when designing any product to kind of see it from a holistic point of view, not to try and maximize one of those things. So I can understand, for example, why the BitKey, for example, has gone for a device without a screen. It's not necessarily a device that I think I would like to use, but I can understand the design decision behind it. And that's kind of my thinking, and what I approach is not to try and take a specific vulnerability and then say, well, we have to fix this because security is the only thing that's important. Yes, we should try and fix it, but we need to consider what is the impact on the user flow. Is this actually going to make the products usable, or is it going to just mean that nobody actually uses them? That's kind of the way that I would like everything to be viewed, that kind of more holistic lens.
The BitKey team actually consulted with us and a few other people in the beginning of the design, and extremely competent people. One of the people who designed their little protocol of how the keys go around is a regular on Twitter. He's just sort of like a known about it. And it's like their intention was never to create a device that is state proof and it's for you to have your quadrillion dollars of Bitcoin. And no, it was like, hey, let's make something that's extremely easy for people that don't mind some privacy trade-offs to come onto Bitcoin and hold Bitcoin securely enough for that set of trade-offs, right? And then maybe they move on to other more secure pastures or more private pastures, depending on what they're seeking, right? We need people doing that. We need companies like Ledger spending a lot of money trying to bring in new users. We need this stuff, right? But and we don't want to completely shock these people coming in with oh my God, you are vulnerable to a nonce attack, when they have 0.01 BTC, you know what I mean? On a fairly secure sort of environment. It's the conversations are important, and we should have them, but there is a place.
Go next. So just to close on the entire anti-exfil and Dark Skippy situation, I think the goal of making devices that are fully trustless, in the sense that that the software wallet can check for every operation that the hardware wallet, the hardware signer does, that the hardware signer is doing what it should do according to specifications, right? So that's from seed generation, from signing, deriving the XPubs, everything that you ask the hardware device to do, right? So the goal of being able to do every of these steps in a trustless way, it's a very interesting goal, and we should move into that direction. So anti-exfil does that only for one of these interactions, and so far it seems that we will require some form of zero-knowledge proof on the device to be able to do that for all the other kinds of interactions, right? But maybe, who knows, maybe in 3-4 years, zero-knowledge proofs will become so fast that we can do them on an embedded device. We'll see. And then at that point, it will become interesting. Until that time, what is practical today is to use multi-signature, to use Miniscript. So the practical solution that people can actually do to solve this problem for themselves is to use multi-signature and Miniscript. So let's make the user interface of multi-signature and Miniscript better and get more users to use them.
I feel like I have Rob on the show here, shilling Miniscript.
I want to say, I think we've hit on this in this talk, but I want to say it very explicitly. The best hardware security device for your Bitcoin is the one that you have and use. And so the right one for any person is going to be different, because some people have only $30 to spend on a hardware device, in which case Casa's new cool keys might be a good way to go, because you can buy a YubiKey for $30. If you have a lot more money, you might buy something else. You have to get something and you have to use it for it to protect your funds. And so everyone has a different UX they can handle, a different cost they can handle. And so like any of the reputable vendors that we've talked about, if you can have it and use it, you're way ahead and probably good enough for a long time.
Yeah. AddBTC, anything else to add?
Yeah, I just think I want to reiterate that not to be afraid of commercial wallet vendors. I think there's incentives that work in your favor there. Kind of like what Rearden is saying. You have the ability of oversight and commercial interests that work in your favor. And there's some vendors that are obviously better than others. Try to figure those out, ask people that know what they're talking about. And then always look for signed updates. That is an essential feature that mitigates so many things that it's hard to even start to list them all, but signed updates at minimum. And then the ways you communicate, that's all secondary to those signed updates.
Fantastic. Well, I think it's been a great panel. We've covered a lot of stuff. We'll close it off there. So thank you to all the guests, and I'll put all the links in the show notes so listeners can find you guys. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.